Welcome back. We're going to continue on in physiology with the respiratory system. So let's go ahead and start talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, oxygen, as you probably know, is bound in the bloodstream into hemoglobin, right? Now, hemoglobin is carried on a 4 subunit protein. Now, the more hemoglobin saturation you have then, the more oxygen that you have being carried. We're going to talk about that a lot in a few minutes. But first of all, let's go ahead and talk about carbon dioxide. Now, there is way more carbon dioxide in the body than oxygen, like 20 times more. And about 90% of it is going around in our body in the form of bicarb. Now, we talk a lot about bicarb, right? And we also talk about carbonic anhydrase, which is used to catalyze bicarb from red blood cells. Now, there's another place in the body where we also talk about carbonic anhydrase, which would be the nephron. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about renal physiology. But when we talk about carbonic anhydrase, there's a whole paragraph there about the transport of carbon dioxide. And this is a place that we talked about just simple diffusion, because carbon dioxide goes into our red blood cells via simple diffusion. I would highlight that, okay? And then when it's in the red blood cells, this is where our carbonic anhydrase works to break it down and form a hydrogen ion plus then bicarb. I'd be aware of that. So, but how does it even get in there? Well, we're going to talk just a little bit about just gas exchange once it starts coming from the air into our trachea. And to do that, I'm going to put it up on the whiteboard. And there's also a picture of that in your book if you want to find the photo, and then just follow along as I draw it on the board. So check this out. So take a look at this picture. So if you see here, air coming into the body has a partial oxygen pressure of 160, all right? Very low carbon dioxide, it's at 0.3. When it gets to the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen starts to decrease. It's about 104, but look at the arteries. The partial pressure of oxygen is 100. So if they ask a question on the test, what area of the body has a partial pressure about equal to the arteries? The answer would be the alveoli. But let's go through here. So now we're going through the body and we're dumping oxygen to those tissues and cells that need it most. And then check out the veins. Look at the veins, and that the partial pressure of oxygen is less than 40. So much less, obviously, than in the arteries or the alveoli. So if they ask you a question on the test asking where the partial pressure of oxygen is the lowest, the answer would obviously be the veins. So that basically tells us about the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide as it goes from our tissues. There's a couple other things I want to bring up here, which is basically what makes or changes the diffusion rates of the oxygen and carbon dioxide. And they're listed there too. But the first thing is thickness of the membrane. So the thicker the membrane or the thicker the wall, the less solubility or diffusion it can have, right? So that makes sense. So that would be an inversely proportional relationship. Bigger membrane, decreased diffusion. The next is the surface area. So this is proportional. So the more surface area you have, the more diffusion that can take place. Remember when we talked about emphysema in pathology, and we talked about one of the reasons why these patients have such a hard time breathing is because they have all these breakdown of alveolar walls. So instead of all these little grapey sacs with a lot of surface area, they have these big balloons that hold oxygen that can never diffuse air across the membrane. All right, so again, that's a proportional relationship. Next is the diffusion coefficient of the gas, and this has to deal with solubility of the gas as well as the size of the gas. And then the last thing is just partial pressure, and gas will always go from a higher partial pressure to a lower partial pressure. All right, so those are 4 things to keep in mind. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is the oxygen dissociation curve. And remember when I was talking about the fact that oxygen is carried on hemoglobin, and that the more hemoglobin saturation you have, the more or higher your oxygen carrying capabilities. And so we can look at that with this curve. And I'm going to go ahead and show this on the whiteboard. And there's also a oxygen dissociated curve in your book, and so you can follow along there. So let's go ahead and take it up to the whiteboard. So if you look here, on the x-axis we have the partial pressure of oxygen, and then on the y-axis we have hemoglobin saturation, all right? So when the partial pressure of oxygen is high in the tissues, hemoglobin can more readily bind to oxygen, so there's more hemoglobin saturation. When the partial pressure of oxygen is low, it can't hold on to as much oxygen. That's what gives us our partial pressure curve that is in that sigmoid shape. When the partial pressure is 50 in the arterial oxygen, hemoglobin will be half saturated. The behavior of this graph is really important because different disease states makes it move to the right or to the left. So if you think about it, if there is a shift to the right, what is that telling us? Well, a shift towards the right indicates that the hemoglobin is less capable of binding to oxygen at a given partial pressure. All right, so what are some things that can cause that? Well, let's list them off here. A decrease in pH, so higher acidity, makes it harder for the body to put hemoglobin, oxygens on the hemoglobin. An increase in temperature and an increase in CO2 levels. And remember, an increase in CO2 levels still makes it more acidic, again, causing hemoglobin to not be able to maintain as much oxygen. So what about some clinical examples of this? Well, clinical examples would include exercise, congestive heart failure, anemia, lung disease, and kiddos. All of those things naturally will make this curve shift to the right. Again, what is that telling us? That it takes more work to get oxygen to bind to the hemoglobin. Now, what happens when we shift that curve to the left? When we shift the curve to the left, basically that makes it easier. It makes that hemoglobin more readily able to bind to oxygen at a given pressure. Less work to saturate that hemoglobin. So things that cause this: higher pH, so basic environments, lower temperature, and reduced CO2 levels. I think that is all very important to know for exam. Another gas that's kind of worthy to talk about as we're talking about oxygen and the saturation is carbon monoxide. So carbon monoxide also binds to hemoglobin much more readily than oxygen does, and therefore it holds on throughout the body for a longer period of time. So let's take a break there. Let's go ahead and answer some questions about that. And when we come back, we're going to start talking about our neural control of breathing as well as acid-base balances. So we'll see you in a bit.